Hey, wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us for our webinar today on student homelessness and what Michigan communities can do about it. My name is Ashanti Jones. I am here with SchoolHouse Connection. I serve as the Senior Policy and Advocacy Manager. And the SchoolHouse Connection is a really great organization that works nationally to overcome homelessness through education. We do a ton of strategic advocacy and practical assistance. We partner with schools, early childhood programs, institutions of higher education, young people who are experiencing homelessness, their families, and the people that serve them. I'm joined here today by my colleague, Rod Montz, who will get a moment to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Ashanti said, I'm Rod Montz. I'm the Director of State Policy here at SchoolHouse Connection, which gives me an opportunity to work with our partners and allies across the U.S., but I am based in the Detroit area, and I'm really happy that we have an opportunity to have a session for our series for the Policy Fellows Initiative focused on Michigan.
Awesome, thank you. And webinars like this are just one of the things that SchoolHouse Connection provides to the national stage. We also do answer questions that you all may have or other people across the state. We do that from our inbox. So if you find yourself with any questions that linger after today's presentation, you can send us an email with that question at info@schoolhouseconnection.org. And we do answer those questions and post those answers on our website. We also host youth leadership and scholarship programs that allow young people who either have interest in this type of advocacy or have experienced homelessness themselves to participate and grow their advocacy skills. And we also do a lot of federal and state policy advocacy work. So we support states in writing bills, getting them passed, and providing testimony, and all of the various ways in which that we can support states and making sure that young people who are experiencing homelessness can utilize education as a tool to ensure that they don't experience that again as an adult. And so our SchoolHouse Connection Policy Fellows program is something that Rod Montz has been leading up for us for a few months now. And so I'll just turn it over to him for a second just to introduce this program and what it's all about.
Yeah, through our Policy Fellows Initiative, we have identified stakeholders that include service providers and youth who've experienced homelessness, who we've trained and equipped to engage in congressional advocacy. So we targeted 8 key congressional districts around the U.S. based on the involvement of their members in Congress. Our fellows conducted legislative visits and actually delivered some of the asks regarding policy work that we'll reference later on in today's program. But the goal is really to build a base of folks that we have in strategic states across the country that we can deploy in federal and state advocacy when we have opportunities to move legislation that will help youth experiencing homelessness.
Thanks. And by now, I am really hoping that all of you are feeling welcome in this space. And I'd just like to also offer up the opportunity to utilize the chat box and the Q&A pieces of this webinar in order to engage with us. So if we are covering information that you have deeper questions on, please feel free to utilize the Q&A in order to get some real-time answers to those questions. And we do have multiple spaces during this presentation where we'll actually stop to answer some questions. So please utilize that feature. And if you want to share any feedback or a comment on anything that's being said, you can utilize the chat box to do that. And so for the rest of this presentation today, we're going to introduce you all to student homelessness and why it is such an issue across the nation, especially in Michigan. We'll also talk to you a bit about what we're advocating for, and then we'll talk about ways in which you can engage with this work and utilize your own personal advocacy to support young people who are experiencing homelessness. And so homelessness in itself is a really prevalent issue. Around 1.1 million young people are experiencing homelessness. And so these are numbers that were gathered for students who are from pre-K all the way through 12th grade, identified by public schools in 2020 to 2021. And so a few years ago, this number was actually around 1.4 million, but due to circumstances surrounding the pandemic, unfortunately, a lot of young people were kind of lost to the system. And so we were not actually able to keep contact with them. And so even though this 1.1 million number is a little bit smaller, it is not necessarily indicative of how many young people are actually experiencing homelessness. And so these challenges that I've expressed have been reported challenges from many of the schools who are supporting young people. They're having issues with identifying and communicating with students who are experiencing homelessness since the pandemic. And homelessness in itself has many faces. And so typically we might consider homelessness to be the kind of display that we typically see, right? When you think about people who are living openly on the streets, and you're thinking, okay, that's what homelessness is. But unfortunately, homelessness is exacerbated by a ton of issues, and it can display in many ways. And so some of those ways is by staying in a motel, whether it's a motel that's paid for by your own money or by a social service organization or any kind of government funding. Staying with other people after a family has been evicted, that's considered homelessness. If you're staying at a domestic violence shelter or any other type of shelter for homelessness, that is also homelessness. If you're couch surfing and jumping from house to house, or living doubled up or tripled up, which is pretty much when 2 or more families are living in a dwelling that's not situated for that many people, that's doubled up and tripled up. Those are all forms of homelessness. And so in Michigan, as you'll see here from the numbers from 2016 all the way through to 2021, the numbers have sort of decreased, but this is not indicative of the actual number of young people. There have been significant issues with connecting with and identifying young people who are homeless. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rod just to give you a bit more of that local context.
Yeah, and I'll add, you'll notice that there was a severe drop-off during the pandemic when school districts across the state really struggled to try to identify what happened to those youth experiencing homelessness. You can go to the next slide. So Ashante did a great job of explaining what this population looks like. And thanks to some data we got from Michigan Department of Education, you'll see here that we have a sizable number of those folks who are living doubled up, 20,446, over 2,000 in hotels and motels, about 3,000 in shelters. And then we have 600 listed here as unsheltered. And it's important to understand that about nearly 14% of students experiencing homelessness are unaccompanied. So those are those students who fall into these categories, but more importantly, they are youth who struggle to access basic needs, shelter and medical care, and are really at risk of human trafficking, being connected to the juvenile justice system, or being victimized otherwise. The good news is that in Michigan, we expect to see some legislative reform aimed at improving their access to housing and shelter and to medical care. Representative Lori Stone from Macomb County has been a great champion and actually recently introduced a bill that would provide them the opportunity to better access medical care and treatment. So we are looking for bigger and better things in 2023 to get our young people the resources that they need.
Thank you for that local context, Rod. And so homelessness and education are linked, and they're linked very closely. 42% of students who have experienced homelessness say that at least one time they've dropped out of school. And not surprising, and shouldn't be surprising to many of us, 60% say it was really hard to stay in school while they were homeless. And a lot of this has to do with the obvious reasons. Not having a home comes with a ton of other social issues that can prevent a young person from going to school and remaining engaged in school. But it's also within the school walls when we are not necessarily trained to identify and support young people. Young people who are experiencing homelessness have an 87% likelihood of receiving disproportionate school discipline, along with dropping out of school and honestly being chronically absent. Right. And so you'll start to see that the achievement gaps between homeless students and low income elementary school students will persist and worsen over time. When our teachers and our Social workers are not necessarily trained to identify young people who are experiencing homelessness. We can't make the adjustments necessary to make sure that they're maintaining connection to school. And having an education is the single most likely thing that young people need to have. Like being able to have a high school diploma or a GED is the greatest risk factor for young adult homelessness. Young people without one are 346% more likely to experience homelessness as a young adult. And when you see that more than 2/3 of jobs require some form of post-secondary education, that makes having a high school diploma or the equivalent more necessary. And so one thing that's really been helpful in supporting schools and students experiencing homelessness has been the McKinney-Vento Act, right? It's a super important strategy to overcome homelessness. And so the McKinney-Vento Act, it aims to remove barriers by keeping young people in their school of origin. So even if they're transient, they're able to maintain connection to their original school. The McKinney-Vento Act also allows students to be provided with transportation. So if there is any significant gap between, in terms of the distance between where their residence is or where they're staying and the school, they're actually able to be given transportation. If they do have to move to another school district, they are provided with immediate enrollment to make sure that there's no disruption to their education. And it also aims to assist students through graduation and beyond. And so a little bit earlier, we talked about the many faces of homelessness and how it presents. And so the definition of homeless under the McKinney-Vento Act lets those same young people who are experiencing living doubled up, living in motels, sheltered, unsheltered, or staying with a family member, any of those forms of homelessness, it gives those young people access to these services. And so we see that there's a significant amount of young people who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And so when they're young people, the percent of young people who've been sharing housing due to the loss of their housing or economic hardship is 77% of McKinney-Vento students in 2020 and 2021 were identified that way. Around 8% of those same students were living in motels or hotels or trailer parks or camping grounds. You also saw about 11% of those students living in emergency or transitional shelters, living in public or private places that are not necessarily designated for regular use for housing. A lot of people are doing that as well. And then you also see young people living in cars, parks, abandoned buildings, or any other form of substandard housing. And so any young people who fall under these conditions are eligible for the pre-K through 12 McKinney-Vento services. So I'm going to give us a second here. I see a couple of things coming in the chat and people are telling us where they're from. Thank you guys so much for introducing yourselves to us and letting us know where you're joining us from. We do appreciate that and keep those coming in. And so if there are any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box or the chat feature to let us know. And so we'll answer those once we get a chance. Okay. So as we move to the next part of this conversation, we want to talk about, we know we just had elections, right? We had elections all across the country. And so we have the final days of our current Congress, right? The 117th Congress, which was pretty much almost evenly split, where bipartisan support was like, you definitely had to have it, right? Because it could go either way when it comes to passing any kind of law or policy. And so some of the issues for this Congress have been the Homeless Children and Youth Funding, and also funding for the Runaway Homeless Youth Act. We also were focusing our energies on housing for Homeless Students Act and pushing for reform of the low income housing tax credit bill. So I'm going to turn it over to Rod right now just to talk about the current status of this budget.
Yeah, so we just had an important election and now we are entering the lame duck part of session. And we really expect to see some activity around homelessness related policy, including some funding issues addressed before the end of the year. So the House has passed some of its funding bills and the Senate Appropriations Committee released draft bills, but there hasn't been any final legislation yet. There's a continuing resolution in place to help keep the government afloat until December 15th. So we have seen quite a bit of activity, and we expect something substantial to happen in the next few weeks. And so we're really trying to get all of our allies and partners to engage in some legislative outreach to make sure we can get some of the funding in place that we need for some of the policies that we'll be talking about today.
So the targeted programs that we are looking at for fiscal year 2023 is the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program and the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program. And so right now you'll see the different requests that are coming in, right? So the president has requested $110 million for the Homeless Children and Youth program. The current level is being funded at around $114 million. But the House has proposed around $122 million, while the Senate has proposed a 32% increase at $150 million. So that's obviously a significant increase and something that we are definitely standing behind. Of course, we can definitely use more money and more funding to support young people, but a 32% increase is a really great start as we begin to lobby for that type of funding. And then for the Runaway Homeless and Youth Act program, the president has requested around $150 million, while the program is currently being funded at around $140 million. The House has proposed $155 million, and the Senate proposed $151.3 million. So we're hoping, that we'll be able to, with the advocacy and people really pushing their legislators to vote accordingly, we'll be able to reach that 150 or at least that 155 million proposed funding for these programs in 2023.
Yeah, we'll really be relying on advocates like you all to help us get to those higher levels of funding necessary. You have the expertise and the connections to youth experiencing homelessness to really help hammer home the importance of funding these programs to the maximum level to achieve the results that our young people need. So we will definitely be trying to recruit as many of you as possible. So part of that activity that I talked about between now and the end of the year will involve the Housing for Homeless Student Act, which was recently reintroduced, and that contains the low-income housing tax credit program, which provides a break for property owners and their tax liability for construction and rehab of rental housing units, which is really significant for families and youth who are struggling to access housing. The program doesn't allow tenants to be enrolled as students full-time, except if they are members of certain groups like foster youth and TANF recipients. So this act is important because unaccompanied homeless youth are not exempt. So they have to choose between whether they want housing or whether they want to pursue education full-time. And with HHSA, there is a provision with the low-income housing tax credit that would allow youth who've experienced homelessness over the last 7 years to access this housing now. So this would be a really beneficial step to getting these students access to housing they need, so they don't have to worry about choosing between whether they have shelter or whether they want to pursue an education. As I mentioned, it was introduced this week. It's bipartisan legislation. You can see a list of the co-sponsors here. And the good thing is this has a minimal fiscal impact. So advocating for this kind of legislation is really a no-brainer. We just need more people to be talking to their congressional members in order to make sure something gets done before the end of lame duck. And then we will turn our sights to next year. The 118th Congress is going to look a little different. There will be a slight majority held by Republicans as a result of our recent election. As you see here, the breakdown has Republicans holding 7 more seats as of now. There are 435 members of the House. There are still some races that have not been called yet. So that number could grow, but 218 is a majority. So we know that they will take control. And there is still 1 race left to be called on the Senate side, but the Democrats will maintain a majority even if there's a tie because they control the White House. The importance of pointing all this out is so that folks know the landscape, but to also lift up the fact that with such narrow margins, bipartisan support is essential. So where there is an opportunity to engage folks in conversations to make sure that we have that bipartisan support we need, we're going to be actively pursuing people to help us make those congressional visits and to advocate for policy reform. January is a great time to educate. We are going to use the beginning of this session to deploy the Army we're trying to build through our Policy Fellows Initiative and the other legislative and advocacy activity that we're involved in. As one tool that we're going to provide the advocates that we're recruiting, we are establishing an online data dashboard that'll provide a snapshot of student homelessness by state, school district, and congressional district. So we will be making an ask of you all to help have those conversations with Congress members, and we're also providing the tools necessary to have informed conversations, both through the data dashboard and some other tools that we provide folks before we have them engage their elected officials, and we'll go over some of those tools later.
So as we do move into 2023, we do want to share with you 3 of our federal legislative priorities that will support homeless children, youth, and their families. And so the first is flexible funding to support homeless children and youth. And we're going to go through each of these. And of course, we'll also provide you the PowerPoint slides and advocacy toolkit to be able to actually move on a lot of this stuff. So yes, not only are we asking for flexible funding to support homeless children and youth, we're actually asking for legislative support to remove barriers to higher education for homeless and foster youth. And also reforming homelessness assistance to better meet the needs of children, youth, and their families. And so when it comes to flexible funding for students experiencing homelessness, we've been advocating pretty rigorously for $800 million with flexibility. So like not just $800 million for the program that can only be used for 3 things, but rather flexibility to meet the distinct and unique needs of young people who are experiencing homelessness. And so this will be added to the annual EHCY appropriations level moving forward. And so the American Rescue Plan actually did give this level of funding to McKinney-Vento liaisons nationwide. And so it was not just something that was just given, right? It was the result of significant and persistent advocacy, right? And so $800 million is the number because it's 8 times the annual appropriation, right? And it's more funding than the previous 10 years of funding combined, right? And so when you are looking at the level of funding that we have now, which is around $100 million, that is only enough money to support around a quarter of all of the educational institutions in the country. And so that means only 25% of educational institutions are actually able to identify, enroll, and support young people in receiving their education and moving forward to higher education. And so we have to really move forward with advocating for this level of funding moving forward so that we can actually meet the needs of young people so that they don't experience homelessness as they become adults. Okay. And so Rod, would you like to talk a bit about the ARP funds and what Michigan has done with some of it?
Yeah, so one of the resources we actually include on our website is a spotlight through which we lift up some of the creative ways in which people have used their ARP funds to address the local needs that they have in their districts. As Ashanti alluded to, this has been a great way to fill in some holes where people haven't had the resources necessary to address what they're seeing on the ground in their communities. Can you go to the next slide? And that's one of the things that we are hoping that you all can help us out with, both from your own experiences and through reaching out to people you know who are doing the work with the young people that we are trying to help at the end of the day. Any anecdotal or hard data that you can provide to us is helpful, especially that which relates to being able to improve student outcomes, to show how new relationships and systems that you're able to fund through ARP dollars are going to be helping students, as well as collecting stories about the families and those youth who are being assisted as a result of those funds. In addition to spotlighting them, we want to use these examples in some of the conversations we're having with elected officials. We're also trying to make sure that we increase awareness through media engagement. So to the extent that we are able to get people who are willing to go on the record and to talk to media about ways in which they are being assisted through providers having additional funding, we're lifting them up and making sure to the extent that we can that we are sharing those stories with elected officials, that we are trying to engage both directly and through social media. And, as I mentioned at the top, we are actively recruiting those of you who are interested in connecting with elected officials and sharing those stories directly. So that has been part of our Policy Fellows initiative, and it has really been beneficial in opening legislators' eyes who have not had direct experience with youth experiencing homelessness or service providers who are working with them directly. I can tell you, as a result of some of those legislative visits, in fact, we had a few congressional members sign on to legislation that we have been advocating for. So the stories you have to share are having an impact, and we hope to be able to use those in the work that we'll be doing through lame duck and into next year. Dustin had a question he asked about our work with COCs and HYDPs, and the team that we have that works on federal legislation has been working with these collaboratives, if you will, in different states across the country pretty closely. We do provide technical assistance for those collaboratives who are looking to pursue funding or who may need additional guidance or assistance with developing and executing plans. And we are happy to be a resource for folks who are looking to get more help in that regard.
Thank you for answering that question. You're welcome, Dustin. Right, and so the second thing that we are lifting up as a priority for 2023 is removing barriers to higher education for homeless and foster youth. And so at one point, the Higher Education Access and Success for Homeless and Youth and Homeless and Foster Youth Act, or the HCY Act, right, was introduced, but we're hoping to see a reintroduction of this bill. And so this bill is important because after young people have left their McKinney-Vento liaisons from the K through 12 space, we're hoping that they're going on to college, right? Because having a post-secondary education is beneficial for employment and also curbing the likelihood that they'd be experiencing homelessness as adults. And so Having something similar to a McKinney-Vento liaison in the higher education space is critical, right? And so having these dedicated higher education liaisons for these young people would help them to navigate the space at their institution and receive all of the support from financial aid and through community that can ensure that they'll be successful while they're there. And so this act would require the designation of these higher education liaisons federally, right? And so that gives every state the option of having a higher education liaison. It also helps to provide a plan for housing so that young people who are experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity can have access to on-campus housing during semesters and on school breaks. And they'd actually receive priority for on-campus housing. So they wouldn't necessarily be told that there's no space, right? Because they'd receive priority housing. It also will provide homeless and foster youth in-state tuition. So no matter where they're coming from, they get the best rate in terms of completing their education. And so there's a ton more provisions that the HCY Act would provide. And so once you get this presentation, you can click all of the links and get a sense of what all of the provisions are. And lastly, we wanted to remove barriers to accessing homeless assistance and housing. And so we're actually hoping to see a reintroduction of bipartisan legislation that would align the federal definition of homelessness for HUD so that it would actually include more flexibility in how children and youth can be identified as being homeless and therefore eligible for HUD assistance. It will also require HUD to honor the local community priorities and needs, not necessarily use their own designations, but really take a good look at what's happening locally and kind of amend by using those local priorities. And it also would improve the data collection on homelessness. And so, you know, as we stated at the beginning of this presentation, the pandemic has really caused us to lose touch with a lot of young people who are experiencing homelessness. And it's already been increasingly difficult, even before the pandemic, to identify young people who are experiencing homelessness. And so the only way that we'll be able to actually get the funding and justify all of the issues that we're lifting up is to actually improve the data collection and get an accurate picture of what youth and student homelessness looks like. And so this bill would actually do that. And so we want to get this reintroduced. And so Rob will talk about what we're asking for.
Yeah, so here's our ask. We're asking you to help us urge your U.S. reps and senators to fund CARP-HCY and RHYA at the highest levels possible, 150 million and 155 million. Ashanti went over the numbers with you all before of what's been proposed and what we're pushing for. And as I said, we need your help to make sure that we are pushing for funding at the highest levels. I am including in the chat here these links also for you. We have created some action alerts that you can use to make these asks directly. We're also asking you to help us encourage your Congress members to co-sponsor that bipartisan legislation that I mentioned before, HHSA, that includes the low-income housing tax credit that will provide youth experiencing homelessness an opportunity to access housing and not have to choose between whether they want to have a roof over their heads or they want to pursue an education, which we know is so important to ending their homelessness and preventing them from experiencing homelessness as adults. And also to continue urging your Congress members to support $800 million in the robust, flexible funding that folks across the country need to address issues specific to the youth experiencing homelessness where they are. We have seen some tremendous examples of what communities can do when they have the funding and are encouraged to creatively think about solutions to helping young people where they are. I included a link in the chat box too of our ARP spotlights, which will provide you some examples of things that have been done here and across the country. I want to make sure I provided that resource for you. when Ashanti asked me to address that earlier. So you have that there, and you can find more information about those resources on our website as well. And with that, I will pause once again for questions. Questions or comments?
Okay, awesome. So as you guys are typing away, we'll wait until the end so you guys can continue to put in Q&A, put any questions in the chat box or in the Q&A, and we'll get to them shortly. But I do want to say thank you for everyone participating in this session. This webinar was really special, especially because Rod is from Michigan, and so I'm sure that he's happy to be able to speak to each of you today about what you can do on the local level. And so we want to encourage everyone to stay up to date on the issues. So if you want to see if your representative has signed on or to co-sponsor any of the bills that we talked about today, you can go to congress.gov and type in the bill number or the name of the legislation to kind of just see where they are. And then of course that gives you, if their name isn't there, that gives you something to talk about with that. Say, hey, like I see that, you know, people are trying to pass HCY or get this $800 million allocation, but I didn't see you were signed on. I'd really appreciate, you know, if you were to represent, you know, represent this in your role. You can also check their social media just to see if they are, you know, talking about these issues. And if not, you can also always tweet at them and say, hey, what about, you know, what about that $800 million, right? And so you can also sign up for our e-newsletter that we send out pretty frequently to give you updates on what's happening federally in other states, to give you a sense of like what's happening so that you can make sure that your representatives are kind of staying on task and maintaining relevancy when it comes to youth and students experiencing homelessness. We also have a federal policy page that you can check out to receive updates. And again, you will receive this presentation, so you'll be able to click all of these things and sign up for various things. And of course, if you have any questions, you can always feel free to email me, Ashanti, at schoolhouseconnection.org, or Rod at schoolhouseconnection.org, and we'll be happy to provide you with any information that you are seeking. And then lastly, we did speak at the beginning and let you guys know that we do provide technical assistance to various states on many issues. And so we set up virtual meetings, we help with the prep for those meetings, we provide 1 or 2 pages on issues, assistance with writing talking points, writing bills, anything that you can think of that would support the work in Michigan. Schoolhouse Connection does provide that type of support. And so in order to stay connected with our advocacy work, you guys can use your phones and use this QR code to sign up to receive those updates. If you can't use the QR code for any reason, the link that it actually links to is right here at the bottom. So that's schoolhouseconnection.org/advocacy sign up. So it's pretty simple and straight to the point. And we do look forward to continuing to work with you all and see you all in the future. I don't see anything coming in the chat or the Q&A. So I'm going to assume there aren't any questions at this time. You can feel free to email us if there's anything that comes up afterwards, and we will send this presentation and an advocacy toolkit that'll help get you started after this presentation. Rod, was there anything else you wanted to lift up before we head out?
Just that our policy fellow from Michigan could not be here with us today. She and I actually made a congressional visit with Representative Brenda Lawrence, who was her Congress member earlier this year, and Representative Lawrence was supportive of what we were doing. She has not signed on yet, so I'll be reaching back to her office before the end of the year to see if we could get support. But I am also happy to help any of you all who may be interested in making a congressional visit personally through the provision of resources that Ashanti just gave you an overview of. So don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I hope to hear from some of you soon.
Okay, and with that, we will give you your day back. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons and have a wonderful weekend. We do look forward to seeing many of your names pop up on our advocacy sign up and subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you again for your time, and goodbye.